Welcome to Living in Color. I'm your host, Farah Nasser, and today we're going to be talking about all things sports. Joining me now is Asa Rehman. He is with Media Pro, and you'll see him reporting for Canada's Premier Soccer League, former Global News sports anchor, so thanks for being here. And Jerome Cheng, he is a video content producer. You've worked with NBA Canada and the Toronto Raptors. Thanks so much, both of you, for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
You both bring a really unique perspective as well, because you're both visible minorities and you cover sports. So what are some of the things that you've seen that have troubled you just covering, the sport that you love?
Well, basketball is my sport, and I have mentioned how I like how progressive it is. But by being progressive, it doesn't mean that we've reached the finish line with it. So you still hear stories, and sometimes you may face it too, situations of racism, whether it's a fan yelling at a different player on the court or otherwise. And
so
I think
that happens.
It happens, and I think it's unfortunate because it's more like racism is used as a weapon to take down someone who is in a high position. There are different ways. I get competition. I get wanting to do everything you can to have an edge, and I get the idea of wanting to affect another player, but to have to resort to that level is really disappointing.
Yeah, and it's sick, really, that this still happens. And we're still hearing these stories, especially in soccer, in Europe, but all over the world, where there will be racist chants targeting a specific player. And it's something that I would have heard as a player. I did hear.
You did hear as a player?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Oh, yeah, they would call me Packy as a player on the field. And it's something that I would shut out.
And you wouldn't play professionally?
No. This was just
for fun,
playing.
And people would say that. And would it be fellow players or would it be people in the stands?
No. It would be people, spectators.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like while you were playing?
It was shocking, especially when you hear it for the first time. You try to make sure it doesn't affect you, obviously.
They use it to try to take you out of your game.
Right.
And
so it's
so using it as a weapon because they know you're doing well and they don't want you to do well. But
exactly.
So how do you
trash talking.
Right. I mean.
But it's not. It's racist.
Exactly.
It's unfortunate because I think that's where, as great as sports can be, it can be very toxic at times. I mean, that's why when it's with regard to race or gender, they always have that term locker room talk, right? They almost frame it in a way where it's excusable because it's sports, because it's in the spirit of competition. But no, there are limits to how these things should go, and there are limits to things that you should be able to say.
In society.
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to how you responded to it. How'd you respond when somebody called you that awful term?
Oh, at the time, I think it was about 12 years old. So I didn't know how to deal with it.
You were a kid.
I knew that I was playing a game and I was having fun and it was fairly competitive. So I kept my focus on that. After the fact, I talked to my parents about it. They basically went as far as to say is, don't let it bother you.
Right.
But at the same time, I didn't know where to go with it or what to do with it.
Do you think it had a long-term effect in terms of belonging with the sport, or did you think, okay, this is just a group of people, it's not going to, because you still play?
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it was a one-off for me in particular. But the fact that happened, and it happened more than once, makes you wonder what sort of impact it might have had on other kids. Or
on
other
other
people.
kids,
Sure.
right.
Yeah.
So it didn't on you, but you think about, other
I
people.
think one thing that is pretty nice is that you kind of get told, don't let it affect you, don't say anything back. One thing that's really good now is a lot of our athletes at the highest levels are making a point to say that this isn't right, to actually make a point to speak out against these sort of things. So I think you get told often that you shouldn't let those things affect you. What I do appreciate is that we are trying to encourage people to really stand up for themselves and defend their culture or their gender or otherwise. They shouldn't have to just kind of take it in silence. So that I'm really happy about.
Now, one thing that sports teaches us is cooperation, is sportsmanship, working in a team. There's so many different things. But when you, for example, I know soccer, a very multicultural sport. I mean, probably the most played sport in the world, right? But when it comes to basketball, there's not a lot of Asians when you were growing up that were playing.
No, not even now, really.
Not even now. So was that a factor for you? Was that a thought for you when you were younger?
It wasn't so much in the moment, just because you don't really think about it right away, but definitely when you start reflecting on it, you realize just small things that happen when you play. I think what affects the most is the first impression someone has of you when you try to play. So for example, if I'm playing a pickup game, someone might say, I've got Yao Ming, or I've got Jeremy Lin. That's really the only two players I can think of that have played at that level that people can identify as someone that looks like me. So I think immediately you kind of almost get pigeonholed into that position.
Oh, so they think just because you're Asian, you play the same position as these players, or they just call you that?
I think it's a little bit they call me that. I think they may make an assumption that I might play like that, which is funny because on a good day, I'm maybe 5'9". I'm definitely not a 7'4" player. So I think it starts there, but I think what's great about sports is it allows you the opportunity to kind of like have yourself seen past that once you actually start playing, once you get more involved.
That's true. What about you, Asa? Did you play with people who were from all different backgrounds when you were younger? Was it ever a factor for you?
Growing up, especially with the game of soccer, you have people of different ethnicities and backgrounds. But the biggest challenge, I think, became playing a certain way. You touched on it a little bit, Jerome, where a lot of players that looked Indian maybe played a certain position or a certain style. And I think in soccer, you may get pigeonholed into playing a certain way, and coaches would even expect that of you. So for me, I think I was always seen as an attacking, offensive, creative player, and from a young age, coached a certain way, I think, to say that that's the sort of player I was. I found that interesting, and I didn't really realize it till after the fact. Every team I played for, I was in a specific position to do a specific job, and it was actually later on as well, reading books about black hockey players in the 90s who were generally enforcers, which I found interesting too, because that's the position that they were given.
I think it's a really good, like that you mentioned, especially looking at now, like we have worked in sports, and we see often that a person gets player comped with someone who looks like them, of the same race or culture. It's not too often sometimes that you find someone who is in the case of basketball, a white player being comped with a black player or vice versa. So that's one thing that you find.
Sportscasters do this.
It happens
very
almost
common.
at every level, yeah. So I think one thing I always enjoy is when people do acknowledge it and try to look at the player for how they play as opposed to what they look like.
Hockey's an interesting example. You both talked about your parents. My husband, huge hockey fan, and my son is now playing hockey. That's a sport that's very white, for lack of a better term. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a cultural element to it. I think for a lot of the places that our cultures have emigrated from, there's no hockey over there. So it's really only when you grow up in Canada that you're exposed to it. I even remember growing up, seeing my classmates all being into it. There was definitely a period where I wanted to play street hockey too, just so I could be one of everyone. Yeah. So it only happens when you grow up and you kind of develop your own tastes and you realize like what really gravitates you to the most. And it happens whether you love the sport or at the same time too, you find similar people with similar interests and you realize you connect that way.
What about finances? Because I know when my parents came here, it wasn't even a thought to put my brother or I in hockey. It was any extra money we had, let's put it in math tutoring or things like just to get your education up to the level that my parents wanted it to be. So do you think that finances have something to do with it?
Certainly. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest hurdles for pursuing any sport. And I think the further you go in your sports, the more competitive it gets, the more expensive it gets. But I believe there are programs now that's changing as well to just provide the opportunity for anyone to play the game.
Now, Asa, let me ask you, because you're a dad, have your daughters ever asked you about, representation or people who look like them? Do you think it's not even a thought for them anymore, like it may be for us?
Yeah, for the most part, it isn't, which I love. But at the same time, I do see that they identify, or they're becoming more curious and asking questions about in particular women of color, and I find great pride in the fact that I can point them in direction and show them athletes now, because it's easier to find. you know?
And I think also for, I mean, you're both men, but even for women, right? For women to see women in powerful positions in sport and women playing sport and doing so well in sport is such a big thing. We've unfortunately just heard that the Canadian Women's Hockey League is shutting down, and it's more of an economic reason according to the league, but that's a big blow for even, I mean, you have girls, women in hockey.
It's tough that way for whether it's a league entirely shutting down or you mentioned from a gender perspective, they talk about in the WNBA how difficult, like the differences in fare, in wages. It becomes a bit of a deterrent, I guess, is kind of the way I frame it. The idea that you couldn't make as much and it may discourage you from wanting to pursue it just because it may not see it as viable as an opportunity. So you definitely want to find ways to offer representation, but also offer it in a way that feels equal.
Jerome, Asa, thanks so much for this enlightening conversation. You both cover the sport, you both play the sport, so it's really interesting to get your perspective. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Living in Color. Thank you for watching Living in Color. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have an idea for a future Living in Color episode, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave them in the comment section.